music no one can ever refuse it. Pulsating, vibrating, reggae, reggae, reggae. Very sky, rock, steady, mental, a quadrillion, a cool minute.
Our listeners and viewers of the Real Stuff podcast. Today we have a very special guest, and I have her tell you about herself. It's Dr. Lesley-Gail. I think there's one more name to come, but I'm not looking at it right now.
Atkinson Swaby.
Atkinson Swaby, yes. And I have heard her speak many times, so I know she have a lot to tell us. And we're going to go into a topic today that we haven't really touched at all since the podcast started. Archaeology, as it relates to, the original Jamaica and the Jamaican people, the first peoples of Jamaica. I know she'll have a lot to tell us about that. Could you please introduce yourself and give us a little synopsis of what you'll speak on today?
Okay. Which means greetings are Jamaican well name is full. But
not hearing you well. Not hearing you well. Could you probably turn off your video so you get a little more bandwidth? Yes. Yeah. Try again now.
Right. I am Lesley-Gail Atkinson Swaby, and I was saying that those in the indigenous community know me as another name, Boianani, which means sweet water flower. Wow. I'm an archaeologist. I'm an educator. I do some writing, and of course, you have your whole world of your personal life, being a mother and a wife. Yes, so I straddle both the field of being an archaeologist and also, being associated with indigenous groups such as the Taíno of Jamaica.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Now, as you mentioned, the Taínos, we know that we were told early in life that the Taínos were here and they all died. But we know that is not true because we see them and speak to them on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
In your line of work, what have you found so far to set the record straight?
Okay, well, I, like many other Jamaicans, were taught about the extinction of the Taíno, and it's Taíno, it's not plural. Taíno is both singular and plural, just like Maya, Aztec. Oh, yeah, so I remember in high school learning about the Arawak. And it wasn't until I reached university, second year specifically, when I learned about the Taíno and the Kalinago. And the Kalinago is who we were taught were the Caribs, or the island Caribs, right? Now, interestingly, there's a lot of controversy in terms of who really settled the Caribbean region and, what they're known as. The thing about it is, just like today, we are known as either Jamaican, Barbadian, Trinidadian, or Bahamian. The indigenous populations, their names are largely associated with their islands. They don't have a collective name that has been recorded, like when we say Caribbean or West Indian, and those terms in itself are highly controversial also. But They are, they are, because I mean,
I know. Mm.
Caribbean is rooted in so much derogative, essence, and the whole concept of being West Indian is, it's problematic. But unfortunately, these things are perpetuated in our culture, in our history, in our education system, and it's going to take a long time to change many of that mindset. So in the historical records, Jamaica is known as Yamaye, and mistakenly, or I wouldn't say mistakenly, I think the Hispanic recording Examaica is what tends to be most popular, and a lot of people assume that that is the Taíno name. But in reference to the island in the Columbus logs, he does refer to the island as Yamaye. And islands like the Bahamian archipelago, where we have Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, there were the Lucayo. Then we know Boracay, Puerto Rico. Cuba still maintains its indigenous name. And we have Haiti, where we get Haiti from, and the Dominican Republic is known as Quisqueya. But then again, the name varies according, to the sources. I don't know how the confusion came about, but at some point during the 19th century, we find that the indigenous people of the Caribbean are being referred to terms such as island Arawaks, which eventually the island gets dropped and they just are referred to Arawaks, which is kind of confusing because they do have the Arawak population, or the Locono people that exist in South America. And of course, Caribs, or island Caribs, which we now know are, Kalinago. In the 1980s, especially in the 1990s, efforts were made by anthropologists, linguists, archaeologists, other scholars to distinguish the populations from the Caribbean, from those from the Southern American continent. And the term Taíno was used to encompass those that lived in largely the Greater Antilles, the Bahamian Archipelago, Northern Lesser Antilles, and what we know as the Virgin Islands. Now, the term Taíno also comes with controversy. The root of it goes back to a few references in the historical accounts of the term El Taíno, Taínon, and it is not known if this was a term to identify themselves as a collective group, or is it in reference to their class? Because in the Taíno class system, the Taíno is what we would call the elite class, or is it in reference to an adjective describing their character, whether they're a friend, relative, good, or noble, which are some of the general adjectives that are used to explain what Taíno is. But regardless of all these controversies, and one of the things with research is that you're only as good as your current data. So until we find the scholarship and the data and evidence to say otherwise, we currently use the term Taíno to express this particular group of indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. Was that helpful?
Oh, yes, definitely. But let me ask this question though. We started out with Arawaks.
Mm-hmm.
Are the Arawaks and the Taíno two different people?
Well, they're relatives. I would consider them cousins, just like we are relatives of other other nations in the region.
Yeah.
We share certain commonalities. We share probably genetic heritage. We share and the heritage of indigenous populations, the heritage of colonizations, and the legacies, whether positive or negative. Not sure there's any positive legacy of colonization, but I'm trying to be politically correct here.
Yes.
But even though there are language barriers in the region, because you have the English speaking, you have the French, Spanish, Dutch, and so forth. There are a lot of similarities, but yet each island is unique in its own way and has its own unique culture that sets it apart. So the Arawaks are definitely related to the Taíno, and so is the Kalinago. You know, all of them fall under the Arawakian language family. I don't know if you remember, but you know, just like how we have family trees in terms of our genealogy, they're language family trees, and it comes from one of the South American language families, especially the Northern Arawakan. So the Taíno, Kalinago, and what becomes Lokono, which are the population that we are referring to when we say Arawak, there are distinct, you know, similarities. So there's a clear cultural and linguistic tie to these.
Well, it begs the question, were they all here in Jamaica and at the same time?
Well, we don't have any evidence of the Kalinago here. And as I had said, that Arawak is specifically for South America, particularly in the Guyanas area. And they said that they're in southern Trinidad, but they didn't travel that far north, you know, to what becomes, or what we know as the Greater Antilles.
So we are basically Taínos here.
Okay, now that now is another complicated scenario. No, people think that all the populations prior to European contact are Taíno, but the truth is that they had ancestors that settled the region, and we know the colonization of the Caribbean started as early as between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. First with indigenous cultures coming from Central America, particularly the Yucatan Peninsula, into islands like Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico. And then we have another wave that came from South America thousands of years later that traveled, you know, whether they traveled up the Lesser Antilles or not is also a question. Right now in Caribbean archaeology, there is so much research, there's so many questions that we need, you know, to be addressed and explored, and, you know, scope for more research. But basically the consensus is, you know, that they traveled up the Lesser Antilles into the Greater Antilles. Jamaica and the Bahamas are one of the later islands to be colonized. We don't know the reasons why. I mean, as a Jamaican, I'm biased because to me, Jamaica is fabulous. It's my personal paradise. I can't understand why anybody would not want to come here. But we have not found the archaeological evidence to date to say that the island was colonized before the 6th, 7th century. Right. So so their ancestors came here, and in archaeology we refer to the earliest colonizers of Jamaica as the Ostinoid, and then we have a later, or locally known as the Red Ware people, because one of the things we do in archaeology is that we associate cultures with the materials that they produce in terms of their technology, whether they're tools, whether they're their arts and their crafts. It's highly problematic, but the truth is archaeology studies fragments of the past in terms of what has survived, and largely, you know, their pottery and stone tools, especially for prehistoric cultures, are what survives. Organic material, things made from cloth, you know, and wood don't usually survive unless in extreme circumstances. So we can only speculate on what survives. So so they are the earliest are known as the Red Ware because they had a very distinctive red pottery, which we assume was made from bauxite clay. It's really beautiful. And then but I'm biased, so I'm an archaeology nerd, so to me everything is beautiful. All right. And then we have what is known as the white Mal people, who they believe came from southwestern Hispaniola, Haiti, and settled the island about the 10th century. The culture that we know as Taíno evolved in the Caribbean, so they are a Caribbean phenomenon, and they came about anywhere from the 10th century to the 11th century to the 13th century, up to the contact with the Europeans, and they do have survivors. And the reason why I say this is that from an anthropological perspective, extinction is very hard to prove, because once you have cultural contact, people interact, whether willingly or otherwise. People form unions, genetic traits and legacies continue, and cultural traits and legacies continue. And even in Jamaica, where majority of us are of African descent, and we may have phenotypically African features, some of us may still carry indigenous genetic legacies. And also we continue these legacies unconsciously. We still eat bami, which we know is kasabi, which is cassava bread, and the techniques in making bami. My great-grandmother, well, my paternal lines on both sides are from St. Elizabeth, St. Bess, and my great-grandmother used to make bami from scratch, and I didn't realize it at the time, but it does follow the indigenous techniques, you know. My great-grandfather was a shrimper, so he had the shrimp pots, which are indigenous. A lot of our fishing and farming techniques are actually indigenous inheritances. The only thing that we may have changed is probably, you know, the materials that some of them, you know, may be made of now. You know, even our food preferences, you know, the fruits and vegetables, we have to give thanks to those who experimented, because, you know, how are you going to know something is edible and it won't kill you unless somebody tries it? I know, yes. You know, but even, you know, when you think about the processing of cassava, because cassava contains cyanide, but these legacies, right, you know, these legacies, you know, continue. And if the people died out, then how is it we still eat these things? We still do these things? There had to be a conduit. There had to be somebody that was around long enough for contact. And I believe the main conduit for the indigenous cultural practices is the African.
Yes.
You know, whether enslaved or otherwise, for the freed, the African, you know, they facilitated, you know, and especially through the knowledge of folk medicines and our attitudes to certain things. I mean, lignum vitae is a national flower, but lignum vitae is a very precious tree to the Taíno. It is the holy tree, the tree of life. Okay. You know, semis, which are symbolic wooden sculptures, representations of certain actions and deities in Jamaica, are made largely from, you know, the lignum vitae. Yeah. I mean, the hummingbird, which is our national bird, was also a very, very important symbol in Taíno mythology and culture. And I mean, the fact that we still have the Taíno on the coat of arms, although I do know that many have, you know, in the past requested it.
I was coming to that now, yes. Set the record straight. Because we learned that was our work.
What, with the coat of arms?
Yes.
Well, I mean, at the time they were told that it was okay. So the term Arawak seemed to be an error on the part of largely associated with the British colonies, because in the Hispanic colonies, they refer to the indigenous people as Taíno. So the term Taíno is not a new term. Yes. It's been one that has been used from at least the early 19th century. But us in the British Caribbean, we have taken much longer to adopt or to utilize that name. As I said, I don't know where the error and the confusion came about, but you know, a lot of people are called names that they don't call themselves. You know, like I can give you, and you know, the Arawaks are an example. They were referred to them as Arawaks, but they don't refer to themselves like that. When
I
you
know.
think of the when you think of the Amazi, which people refer to as the Berber, they don't call themselves as Berber. They are the Amazi. You know, and the Berber is actually a very derogative term. So a lot of in a lot of times in the past and even in the present, you know, cultures are mistakenly or deliberately, for whatever reasons, you know, mislabeled. And unfortunately, the thing is that it's perpetuated, and that's what we need to stop doing, is to stop perpetuating the misconceptions. So one of the myths that I would like us to stop doing is to say that the Taíno were extinct, because as I said, it's very hard to prove complete extinction. You know, we have never really done a thorough DNA test in Jamaica. They have done a few genographic studies, but we haven't, but that's only really in maroon territories, like in a compound. You know, we would be very interesting if we did a more wide-reaching study to see what is our composition, because you can't look at somebody and what they look like on the outside and say what their heritage is. You can't do that. Yeah.
But moving up from that, from the Taínos, and then came the Africans. What are you finding is what happened basically?
Okay, well, now we're gonna touch on the whole concept of maroon.
Yeah.
Okay, so in islands like Jamaica, the first Africans arrived early 16th century, not because Columbus, you know, claimed Jamaica for Spain in the late 15th century, means the island was settled by the Spanish, you know. So that didn't happen until the early 16th century, about 1509, 1510, depending on your source. And the first European capital is Sevilla la Nueva, or New Seville, or Seville, which is now on the north coast in St. Anne.
Yeah.
The JNHT has a Seville Heritage Park there. And it is there we have the earliest introductions of enslaved Africans. It is said in 1513, the first came in. Now, one of the reasons why the Africans, or the main reasons why the Africans were introduced, was because of the rapid decline in the populations of the indigenous peoples due to, you know, contact with the Europeans, especially the diseases. You know, their diseases did more damage than anything else, because they didn't have the immunity to survive that contact. And also, you know, because of brutality, Spanish brutality. Now, whether it was deliberate or accidental, the contact with the Spanish had a very, very negative impact on indigenous populations and culture. And this is not limited to the Caribbean. This is across the Americas, widespread across the Americas. Also during that time, certain systems of enslavement were introduced. People tend to think that slavery only exists in the transatlantic slave trade. That's just later on, but there are many other systems of forced labor, right, and servitude. And during the time of contact with the Taíno, we have what was known as the repartimiento and the encomienda systems. And as I had mentioned before, the diseases and the brutality led to a rapid decline in indigenous populations. And then we have a character named Bartholomew Las Cascas, who in the defense of the Indians recommended that the Africans were a better substitute for labor. Because during this time we have the introduction of sugar king, which eventually becomes king sugar, and the most important crop in the Caribbean for many, many centuries. And that proposal was agreed to. And the Spanish were the first to introduce the Africans as enslaved labor. During this time, though, a lot of people think that so one of the negative stereotypes about the indigenous populations is that they were peaceful people. I mean, that's nonsense. You can't label, people like that. People react to circumstances and in defense of their home. And there have been also incidents of the Taíno fighting back. And there's also cases of them migrating into the interior to escape these enslavement systems, right? And, living independent lifestyle. Now that move is in essence what we know as maroonage, or what it means to be a maroon, to escape enslavement and to settle in the inaccessible interior and to fight to sustain this freedom. So for people like me, I think the first set of maroons were more likely Taíno, and they would have known the terrain much better than anybody else, because they had lived on the island for hundreds of years before the arrival of any of the other cultures. We know that with the arrival of the English in 1655, this led to the English-Spanish War, which spanned about 5 years. And one of the issues I have with our education system is the liberties that we take, the artistic license we take with history. So we're always taught that, Jamaica became a colony of Britain in 1655, which is not true at all. Yes, England invaded, right? But Spain did not let go until really 1658, when they lost the decisive battle at Rio Nuevo, which is one of the reasons why the Rio Nuevo battle site is such a historic site. But they don't teach these things. And then we were formally ceded in 1670. But this battle was important because, as you know, it led to the emergence of the indigenous culture that we know as the Maroons. Whether some of them were freed by the Spanish to help them in their fight against the English, whether some of them were duplicitous, because these are some of the negative stereotypes that surround the Maroon people, as conniving, but they migrated into the interiors and settled in, the Blue Mountains, Wandabolas, Cockpit Country. Sadly, only a small amount of these Maroon settlements still exist. Most notably, Accompong and Scots Hall and Moortown and Charlestown, But especially in the 17th century, there were much more, 17th to 18th century, there were much more Maroon settlements in the interior of the island. But they are known for their fierceness, their passion, their resilience, the desire to maintain freedom, and also for their ability for self-preservation. And unfortunately, this has led to a very negative relationship with African-Jamaicans, who, there seems to be some distrust between the Maroon communities. But my question is always this. At the end of the day, when you think about life, who do you protect first? You protect yourself and you protect those you love, you protect your family, And nothing is wrong with self-preservation, but I'm not excusing anything. I'm just saying sometimes people have to do what they have to do within the context that they're living in. But as I said, it has led to a very negative relationship with many of the African Jamaicans and their, you know, their descendants. But it is what it is, sadly.
When you see that the Taínos, some of them went in the interior, and then the Maroons come and, I mean, the Africans come and doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or you seen the mix at that time?
Well, they're okay. So most cultures have their origin story or their creation story, which explains how they came about and how they see the world. But there are two main origin stories. So there's, with the Maroons, there are some Maroons who acknowledge and who believe that they are descendants of Taíno.
Okay.
And that the Taíno and the Africans interbred and created this Maroon line. And then there are other Maroons that don't.
Okay.
That don't. Interestingly, some years ago, there's a genetic anthropologist. Her name is Jada Ben-Torres, and she did a study with Harcourt Fuller. I hope I got his name right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And they did a study at a compound in which they were trying to trace the maternal line, because usually when you're tracing your genealogy, you trace it through your mother, your mitochondrial DNA.
Mm.
And they were able to identify a non-African maternal gene that is indigenous American. And that study, you know, looked at all the potential candidates that could have, you know, been the source for that line, including the Taíno. I don't know if you remember during the British wars with the Maroons, they brought in what are known as the Mosquito Indians from the Americas to help in their fight. In the 19th century, it has been even said that Native Americans such as Cherokee even ended up in Jamaica through some illicit trade. Yes. So actually, some individuals from St. Elizabeth are said they've done their DNA, and it's a Native American, and it is believed to be Cherokee. It is something that's not very widely circulated, but I've encountered it more than a number of times.
Okay.
So in that study, Ben-Torres and Fuller were exploring, you know, the presence of the indigenous American gene in the Maroons of a compound. And also Ben-Torres in her studies identified indigenous presence spanning from as low as 2% to 70+%. I was really shocked. I'm not gonna lie to you, I was really shocked. I never expected it to be so high, because most individuals that I know who've done these things like Ancestry.com and 23 and me and stuff, if they do these tests, they don't usually get more than 2 to 10%. To find anybody over 10% of indigenous American DNA, to me is, you know, is amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So is a lot of work still being done?
Well, I would love if we could, as I said, explore you know, other parts of the islands, because as I said, Ben-Torres, her study was in a compound. But if she could do her study to include also the Windward Maroons and also other members of the Jamaican society. I mean, I would love to get it, you know, I would love to do it myself, you know, just out of curiosity. Not that it will change how I feel and how I see myself, but just, you know, just to know.
Yes,
you
yes,
know.
yes, yes.
You know, but I would never do Ancestry. Nothing is wrong with that, but I would prefer if it's done by a scientist that I know personally.
Yes. Mhm.
You know, but in terms of archaeological research, the Taíno has always been, and I'm just phrasing it how it's phrased, objects of curiosity.
Mhm.
Especially during the colonial period, for them to obtain not just natural specimens from Jamaica, but also cultural specimens. And by natural specimens, I mean even their human remains.
Mhm.
You would not believe how many indigenous Jamaican human remains are overseas as parts of collections
Really? I
from
didn't know that.
prominent repositories and cultural remains that have left the island from even before the 19th century, going back to even the 17th and 18th century. Recently, a couple years ago, the Honorable Olivia Grange, our Minister of Culture,
Yeah.
the Entertainment and Sports, spoke about the desire of Jamaica in the return of the Carpenter's Mountain Semis, which are 3 wooden sculptures that were found in Jamaica in what was then known as Vere, but is now Manchester.
Okay.
In the 18th century, that are part of the collection of the British Museum.
Okay.
And it's not the first time that Jamaica has attempted for the return of these sculptures, but the previous efforts have failed with the British Museum. And sadly, these are just 3 of thousands of Jamaican objects that are overseas, that we don't really have access to, unless you get their permission for you to conduct research,
Yeah.
and they're willing to to facilitate it. I am happy that that Minister Grange is passionate about the return. I would love to see them in my lifetime.
Oh yeah.
I remember going to the British Museum, and unfortunately they weren't on display, because the British Museum only displays a minute amount of their collection at any one time. I think it's about 10%, and they have millions of objects.
Oh yes.
But I would love to see them in real life. So interest in the indigenous cultural material and archaeology, of course, it depends on the political climate, and it's been up and down over the years. The most recent major site is White Mile. I don't know if you know White Mile is Central Village.
Yes.
Right. Right. And White Mile is was our largest and longest occupied pre-colonial site. I mean, spanning centuries, 5-6 centuries. It once spanned about over 30 acres, but sadly only a quarter of it exists, and it is constantly being encroached on due to development, whether infrastructure or housing or other commercial developments. And some years ago, there was a joint excavation with the University of the West Indies, the Jamaican National Heritage Trust, and to a lesser extent, the University of Leiden, which went on for a few years between 2016 to 2019, but then COVID happened. And, due to COVID and other factors, those excavations are on hold at the moment. And I hope the funding can be materialized for it to be, continued. In terms of maroon archaeology, the first lecturer at the University of the West Indies, when they introduced the archaeology program, was a Ghanaian by the name of Emmanuel Kofi Agorso. He passed sadly last year, and he specialized in maroon archaeology, and he conducted excavations at Nanny Town, the original site established by Queen Nanny herself, that was later destroyed by the British. He did excavations at Seaman's Valley and also other sites within Portland, particularly in the Blue Mountain range. But since then, there hasn't really been a lot of focus on maroon archaeology. In terms of African-Jamaican archaeology, we have from in the 70s, the likes of Professor Barry Higman, who did work at Mount Pelion and Roehampton. And if you remember, in the 1831-32, the Baptist War, Roehampton Estate in St. James was one of those that went up in flames by the enslaved Africans. So, definitely that's a site of importance. And then we had later excavations at Seville, Drax Hall, where enslaved African remains have been unearthed. And in '97, when Emancipation Day was restarted, that was a good year for holidays. Because that's the year Prime Minister Patterson declared the holiday when we qualified for World Cup. Right. But Emancipation was reestablished in 1997, and they had a wonderful celebration at Seville, where they reinterred 4 of the enslaved Africans that were found in the old village. 3 men and 1 woman, young girl. Her name was Crystal. A year later, through the efforts of Mignon Phillips, Crystal was returned to Africa along with the remains of another enslaved African from the US, and that was yes, you may be able to find videos. It's called The Homecoming, and this took place in '98, and it was Ghana's first celebration of Emancipation Day. So it was a wonderful event. The remains of the 2 enslaved Africans, they went back through the door of no return. Can you imagine how incredible that must be?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, sadly, they were the only ones ever to come back, but I'm glad that they were able to.
Yeah.
Yes. So a lot of good things. Unfortunately, we are not promoting what's happening here as much as we should. The public is not aware.
Yeah, following up on that though, I don't know if you can answer this, but over the years, has the government of the day showed any interest or enough interest in things like this?
Well, I would say yes. In different ways, because I mean, it's not just about the study of archaeology in terms of doing the excavations and analyzing the remains and setting up museums, but we also need to protect what we have. So they've contributed in different ways. So for example, our late former Prime Minister, Edward Seago, he's actually responsible for expanding. Okay, so what is known as the Jamaican National Heritage Trust, which is the government, well, it's a statutory body, but it's still, quasi-government, and they're responsible for, archaeological research and, protection of sites and monuments and so forth, and they do have the JNHD Act, which allows them to declare things national monuments and protected national heritage and so forth. So it was a part of the Institute of Jamaica, and he separated it and expanded its mandate and its legislative powers. It was instrumental in the preservation of sites, as you know, like Devon House, he actually rescued it from being another version of Abbey Court.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, at that corner there, they used to call it the Millionaire's Corner, and Devon House in the 60s was slated for development, and he instituted what became known as our first preservation order, and that facilitated Devon House from being in the hands of apartment developers.
Yes.
And we do have, you know, one of the challenges though I find is not that there isn't interest. There are some who are interested. I find the issue is the buy-in, and everybody thinks that for culture and archaeology and heritage to have value, it must have an economic tie. It must have an economic value. And there are certain aspects of life that you can't always tie with economics, you know? So people think that if we're not doing or making money from heritage tourism, then preserving our culture is not important. Mm-hmm. Preserving our cultural remains is not important. But these cultural remains are an integral part of our own identity, our collective identity as a nation. You know, it represents all that we went through, you know, collectively to become the Jamaica that we are today, and hopefully the Jamaica that we can continue, you know, into the future, so that our children or successive generations can inherit, you know, this essence. And you know, that's one of the fundamental issues that we do have, that enough money or enough appreciation isn't there, you know, that we need to protect this heritage. As I had mentioned, Minister Grange talked about wanting to return the Carpenter's Mountain semis, and she also mentioned about the creation of a registry for cultural objects and spaces, you know, that are of significance to the nation. So I'm hoping that this will come underway pretty soon.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, Madam, I thank you very much for today. And,
you're welcome.
I mean, there's so much more for us to discuss, you know, so I'm going to be asking you to come back so we can, you know, explore more of this, because what you're talking about, I know that most Jamaicans don't know most of this, because I'm hearing lots of stuff that I could even think existed. I think it's very important, you know, that the people up in Jamaica and the Caribbean, because this is a Caribbean podcast, you know.
Yes, I realized, yes.
And you have a lot to tell us about the rest of the Caribbean.
Well, I'll be happy to share whenever you are ready, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. And Courtney will get back to you as to another date where we can, you know, move on from here. But
okay,
it has been splendid, and I thank you so much.
All right, take care.
You too, yes.
You lead us to full. You belong far away away. Ajuguala leva buseru. Lida mua, lida sungfula. Lida mua, lida sungfula.
Well, unfortunately, this is it. Till next time. Bless.
All you gotta do is just speak. One word is enough, and I'm no longer so rough. I forget what I was trying to say. I no longer do what I was gonna do, but you're no good for me. That's why me know say me have to go flee. Me have to take away myself. Me have to take away myself. Me have to hide like a thief in the night. Me have to get out of sight. Me have to take away myself. I have to take away myself. I have to utilize I will.